where we come together regularly and intentionally to have spiritually minded conversations about life, belief, and the intersection of the two. And the most important thing for you to know right now is that absolutely everybody's voice matters in the conversation. So if you're here for the first time, I'm excited to have you. If you're here for the 75th time, I'm excited to have you here. I am joined by a friend of mine who I have been, just kind of. I'm not going to lie to you guys. I tossed a Hail Mary out there to try and make this conversation happen, and I am pleased to announce that it is in fact happening. But we are joined by let's say a biblical scholar who is in a league of their own in my estimation. And I'm going to let them introduce themselves to you now.
Hello, everyone. I am the Reverend Wil Gafney, the Right Reverend Sandy Halsey Professor of Hebrew Bible at Bright Divinity School.
Thank you so much for coming on here, Dr. Gafney. Like I was saying a little bit before we started, your work has been some of the most inspiring work that I've read. And I grew up, I was a pastor's kid in an evangelical denomination camp, and I went down there with my brother, and my brother bought Sea Monkeys, and I bought The Fourfold Gospel by A.W. Tozer. So that's just kind of the person I've always been. But coming to your work and reading your work for the first time this past year really enlivened my understanding of the Hebrew scriptures, and it tied it together with so many practicalities that I was kind of culturally. Right now, if you listen to the evangelical lens, we hear this anti-critical race theory, sort of social justice is from the devil kind of language coming out, and your work tied together a deeply rooted understanding of the Hebrew Bible with these practicalities that were true and that I knew to be true in my heart. And I'm so excited to talk about that with you tonight.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So, for those of you who don't know, we're just gonna maybe start out with a little bit of an introduction and ask Dr. Gafney, would you kind of just tell us a little bit of how you got to
during college and to be serious about my Christian identity, and subsequent to that, it was an invitation from our pastor at the time, and so I. Fasted, prayed, discerned that I had a gift and calling to teach, and later understood that in terms of preaching, and then later in terms of pastoring. And by the time I was in divinity school, I knew that I was going to go on and do PhD work, but because I was a research biologist at the time, I was fairly well set on doing theology and focusing on reproductive ethics.
Okay.
But I loved Hebrew so much. I loved my Hebrew Bible professor. The late Gene Rice taught both my Hebrew and my introduction to Old Testament, is what they called it there, and loved him, loved the insights into the language. And so that was more of a falling in love and waking up and realizing, well, this is where I already was. In addition, the path to go forward in theology was coincidence, but I couldn't get an appointment with the person in the program I wanted to interview with. I couldn't get the application. They swear it mailed. It never showed up at my house. Just all of these things. I just could not physically get an application into that program, let alone get my person into that program. And I got what I needed in fairly short order, with one hiccup, to go forward in Hebrew Biblical Studies.
All right.
And it made sense in terms of my identity and formation as a product of the Black church. I did a project in seminary, and I stand by this notion that Black Christians in the Americas are largely Hebrew Bible Christians. Those are the stories we know. Hebrew Bible plus Jesus, and a couple of carefully selected epistles from time to time. But our canon within a canon is largely the Hebrew Bible, and that's certainly my experience.
That's fantastic, because I grew up, just speaking candidly, I came from a background that was just heavily steeped in sort of what would happen if we only had, the synoptic gospels? What if we only had the words of Jesus? And in that effort, I feel like what happened is a similar thing that happens to a lot of evangelicalism, is it kind of becomes like a fast food theology, is what I refer to as like fast food MIC churches, right? We have prefab buildings, we have easily digestible theology, we don't have moorings to church history, and we can become the church of the sexy coffee bar. And in that, I feel like we lose a certain richness and rootedness, from the text, from the scriptures, from the life stance of the Hebrew and Israel people.
And from Jesus, after
Yep.
all, Jesus was a Hebrew Bible person.
Yep.
Class.
Mm-hmm.
And when I got to the story of how Dr. Thurman, Reverend Dr. Thurman, was in India, and an Indian man was saying to him, "Brother, what are you doing as a Christian?" And he just ran down the racist, xenophobic, imperial, colonial legacy of Christianity: enslavement, genocide, land theft, um, forced baptism, all of these things. And Dr. Thurman says, I'm a follower, and I know that the religion of Jesus was rooted in the scriptures of Jesus. And if I were going to get at that thing, then I needed to study the religion of Jesus.
Yeah.
At this point in my life, that may sound a little bit like colonizing the scriptures.
Mm-hmm.
I was very clear that Jesus was Jewish, which Dr. Thurman was very clear about, and I wasn't hearing a lot of people saying that.
Right.
And that his religious identity was an affirmative identity born out of the Hebrew scriptures and not in opposition to it, as some of the very anti-Semitic teaching, including some of the Jesus is a feminist because his tradition was bad, but he was good because he was a feminist, that sort of binary thinking. But this was a different way of saying the Jesus movement, as some of us have come to say later, was deeply rooted in the Hebrew scriptures. That's where he turned to preach. That's all he preached. That's what he lived. And so the religion of Jesus is a religion of the Hebrew Bible with a, shall we say, a big reveal at the end.
Yes, I love that. And I think it's precisely that that sort of situated knowledge and that rooted understanding that really started to speak to me, and kind of helped me see the Bible in a way that I hadn't in my previous 30 years of reading it, right? And what I also like is that you simultaneously root down into the scriptures and then reach up to connect things that are happening in our very real, tangible world now. And that's kind of where I came up with the title, Those That Are Silenced by the Scripture. And that's something that you did so incredibly well. You used your sort of, your sanctified imagination to pull out those stories of the woman, the slave, and the other in the scripture. And I feel like a lot of times people think that it's either like the Bible is not practical for today, or the Bible is detrimental for those groups today. But I'd love to hear kind of what was your process of understanding it and wanting to give life to the story of the woman, the slave, and the other through that womanist midrash book? How did that come up for you?
The focus on women was nurtured to some degree by just my experience in the world when I encountered the experience of women that was vastly different. And I was in seminary before I realized, and understood that there were women who were being told they were not allowed to preach or pastor because they were women. I don't know how I lived in this America and didn't know that was happening someplace other than the Roman Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church. But I really didn't know that. I was baptized in an AME church, even though our pastor was male. I never made the assumption this pastor is male. Therefore, women pastors are illegal. Just this pastor is male. That's an incomplete statement. And so when I encountered classmates, and many of these women were coming out of Baptist traditions, some Kojic, some Assemblies of God. I was not terribly sympathetic because I really didn't appreciate how deeply rooted they were in those traditions, how much love and sweat equity they had in them. And so for me to say, well, let's find a church that ordain you, like why is this a problem? That wasn't a terribly mature response, but that was all I had.
Right.
And in those conversations, why was I so sure when they, and apparently their entire church superstructure on several continents, had a different opinion? And I said, well, there were women prophets. God called women prophets. How is a prophet not a preacher? It's like I didn't even have to get to the New Testament, the first witnesses of the resurrection, to proclaim the gospel of a resurrected Christ. That is what the gospel is. But I was just befuddled that this was so complicated. So that knowledge of and appreciation for women prophets turned into me being scooped up by this same Hebrew Bible professor to be his research assistant on Kings. And in Kings is the story of the prophet Huldah. She was a woman prophet whom I did not know about. And so that was even more exciting. That turned into a paper, turned into a conference paper, turned into my dissertation, turned into my first book, Daughters of Miriam, which was an exploration of prophets in ancient Israel and the ancient Near East. So I started there. And then when I was in graduate school, not sure how this conversation began, but my dissertation advisor relayed that a gentleman on the housekeeping staff would come and take advantage of her access to her and get questions and answers for his Sunday school class. And he said to her, I know Mary is the most common woman's name in the New Testament. What's the most common woman's name in the Hebrew Bible? And this Hebrew Bible professor and archaeologist, I have no idea. That led to a project that became the Dictionary of Women in Scripture, which is a phenomenal resource that covers every woman in all three canons of Scripture, either by name, alphabetically, or by chapter and verse, where they're daughter of such and such. And so, by the way, the answer to that is Ma'akah, and there are more women named Ma'akah in the Hebrew Bible than there are Marys in the New Testament. So, in the front work for that project, she talked about how in the Hebrew Bible there are a good 111 women whose names are preserved, and then there are all of these women whose names are not preserved, and that also arrested me. Like, well, I could count not 111,
right?
And I know a lot of women in the Hebrew Bible,
right?
And so that crystallized the idea that my next project was going to focus on these women who are on the margins of the scriptural tradition, women who are available to us, who we don't know, they're minor characters. And the work I did in the book on prophets focused on how women are always present in expressions like Israelites or children of Israel, or in the really antique translation, the sons of Israel. The sons of Israel left Egypt. Well, they didn't leave the daughters of Egypt behind.
Right.
And so I began the work that I continue in the women's lectionary of translating these common plurals inclusively and explicitly. So instead of Israelites, I would say the women, children, and men of Israel. Putting all the people on the page, recognizing that that's binary language, but that's what they were working with at the time. So this interest in these women who, even folk who studied scripture didn't know anything about, led me to wanting to do womanist midrash and focus on some of these lesser known characters.
Absolutely. And I love that you do that. You do that, obviously it's the point of the book, but you do it so poignantly when you bring everybody into the conversation. And I think in that book, when you start off with the experience of, like a family meal type setting, and you talk about bringing everybody in and listening to everybody's voice, like I could tangibly feel the stage that you were setting, which was a stage I hadn't seen set in the Hebrew scriptures. And it really deeply moved me, because that's a practicality I hadn't seen drawn out so far. I grew up in that sort of background where, not to shout out a denomination, but the Christian Missionary Alliance will not ordain women. They will consecrate them, which is the same process, but they will not ordain them and they are not allowed to be pastors. You can do everything else and you can do the same course of study, but you can't be a pastor. And so to see you pull forward the voice of the other and to simultaneously know that I am the other in a lot of my previous church settings because of being a queer person, I felt like I had a space at the table. And I felt like the stories and the ways in which you told them, you came straight on at topics like orientation, at topics like not non-consensual sexual relationships, and topics of people being taken as slaves, and you somehow, maybe you didn't make it all make sense, but you said their names, so to speak, to use common nomenclature. What do you think, if you can look back on your time of writing from this voice, what's been one of the biggest things that you've seen as you've started to intentionally seek out and give space to the voice of the woman, the slave, and the other in the scriptures?
Well, the primary issue, and I use this example sort of everywhere I go, is probably needs to be trademarked at this point, and I'll say it when I'm preaching on Sunday, is we tell a more complete story. So if we say that God is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, we are keeping faith with our scriptural heritage, and that is a story that is indeed told. And that is literally a true story. Historically, do with that what you will. But that's not the whole story, and that's not even the only story. If we say that God is the God of Hagar, Sarah, Abraham, and Keturah, Rebecca and Isaac, Rachel, Leah, Bilhah, Zilpah, and Jacob, we're telling a completely different story, a story that includes enslavement, polygamy, that includes rape and forcible surrogacy. Pull out of the story, you get a sanitized story, at least on the surface, but all of that stuff is still there.
Yes.
We then have to ask some theological questions. Is God the God of these women we just named? And do people even know those names to say those names, right? So why don't people know those names? And particularly Bilhah and Zilpah, who are the enslaved women who are responsible for a quarter of the 12 tribes of Israel, right? So why don't we know those names? Then would these women say that the God of their enslavers, in whose names they were inducted, raped, impregnated, and had their children claimed by a person who said that they owned them and their body and their sexuality and their reproduction? Well, we know Rachel might say no, because one of the stories we have of her is that when she left with her new husband, she took her father's household gods. Presumably they were her gods, and if she was going on this new adventure, starting this new family, she was taking her religious stuff along. So she might not say that was her God. The enslaved woman might not say that that's her God. So how do we preach God and tell this whole story and account for the fact that the people who are the central perspectival subjects, are slaveholders and rapists and all of this, and not yield to the crutch that says, well, it was the time.
Right.
Because in the middle of that, you've got Isaac, who's the only patriarch, and maybe the only major biblical character who did not indulge in polygamy. He had one wife. Like, it didn't matter what everybody else was doing. He made some different ethical decisions, right? So that's the difference, is that you tell a completely different story that's supposed to be the same story, and immediately causes you to wrestle with the theological implications of a much more complicated, much less nice, much nastier set of ancestral stories.
Yeah.
And then we have to ask seriously, is this our God? Is this even God? And that's why I have the literary structure in Womanist Midrash of God in the text and God beyond. It is too small, too petty, too much like an Iron Age warlord, too ignorant of science, still believes that the earth is flat with four corners, right? So that's the consequence. That's what happens. That's what you get.
Yeah. And I think that I was asked this question recently on TikTok, YouTube, and Facebook because this person really wanted to know my answer to this. But they sort of, from what I understand of this person, they're a former evangelical, former theological student who really ran up to some things that they couldn't cognitively resolve and now identify as a secular humanist. But they very aggressively said, well, how can you, they put the red flag emoji like 10 times, first of all, so I knew it was going to be a super mature comment. But their question still holds. And the question was, how can you continue to be a part of a church that on so many levels devalues your existence? And they were asking that of me as a queer, trans, non-binary person, right? But I think that there's many groups of people that have experienced rub with the scriptures. Certainly the African American community, certainly those who have a female, are female bodied or have a female experience. What do you think keeps this story that is messy and that is raw and that is in its unsanitized form very hard to deal with sometimes? What do you think keeps people that are the woman, the slave, or the other, or people who are marginalized? Why do you think that people keep coming back to this story in this text?
For some of us, the story is not just a story, and the story is not the only story. The story is a marker, a signpost, representing an encounter with something that's bigger than the text, bigger than the world. So that there's a phenomenological engagement with God who is just quite simply not limited to the church or the box the church has constructed, and not even limited to the text. And I had a version of this question myself, and I was saying on Twitter that there is God beyond the text, and this poor person was saying, there is nothing beyond the text. And I said, well, even in the text, it says, in the beginning, there was no text.
Right.
What? Like, they were just, so, and for a while, my Twitter biography said things like, vanquisher of biblical illiteracy and bibliolatry, the idolization of the Bible as a divine figure. I told my intro students that one of the first theological conundrums they need to work through is if the tradition they affirm says that Jesus is the Word and Jesus is human and divine, if you turn around and say the scriptures are the Word and the scriptures are only divine, then you have made the scriptures more divine than Jesus. Is that the theological claim you want to make? And how are you going to defend that? So we start with that early, that our slogans and t-shirt bumper stickers have import, and critical thinking, not critical race theory, because we don't really do that in seminary, but critical thinking means you have to contend with and be responsible for and argue for the points you make, no matter how cute it is, how much it rhymes, or how perfectly it fits on a t-shirt or bumper sticker.
Yes.
Right?
Absolutely.
You have to make that thing make sense and be accountable for its implications.
Yes. I like to refer to that sort of idea. It's something that I wasn't always aware of, and I don't really remember the moment I became aware of it. But I understood it retrospectively as every statement has a negative space. There is a negative space to everything we say. And when you are, this came up, this sort of idea started to come to mind when I was in my my undergraduate studies, which were actually pastoral ministry. So taking on seriously the task of understanding what it means to be a pastor, I came to an and if you can't have a conversation or you can't say something publicly without first thinking of the negative space, you shouldn't be making proclamations, certainly not on the part of God. because everything you say has a negative space. So if this person idea that not a lot of people take serious and the implications for the other, think more. We are not in cloistered pulpits and in cloistered narthexes and in cloistered fellowship halls anymore. The world is happening in the streets, and the church can either meet it or it can stay cloistered, but it demands a higher level of rigor if we're going to step out there and really engage in an intersectional world.
Yes.
Maybe that was just me talking and you're just here to affirm me for a second, but I think that one of the more powerful things that you did in Womanist Midrash for me was you approached sort of hot button topics like slavery, polygamy, same sex relationships, right? Like you approached all these things from a very real and cognizant understanding. When you speak,
for the most part, I don't think in a segment of the seminary population in a previous institution where, because of working hours and social economic strata, you had a lot of African American pastors who had full-time jobs and were going to seminary in the evening. And I had a reputation, and some of the students were friendly with me, and they would say things like, "Doc, they warned me about you." Okay, what do they say? What's the warning? They said, "You're really feminist and stuff." And I said, "Yes." And I said, "What else?" They said, "But you in the Word, Doc, you in the Word." And so part of what my Black church formation has done for me is that what I do is delve deeply into the text, and that's the starting place. And this is not to critique other forms of religious guild academic endeavors, but in some frameworks where people theorize theological constructs and then apply them to the world, or apply them to the solar system, or apply them to legal codes, that can be abstract for folk. But if I say we're looking at this passage, and we're looking at this passage in light of the history and social structure of the peoples around it, and we're looking at this vocabulary, and we are, going deep into the Word, and people recognize that there's a knowledge base there, but also that my pedagogy is an empowering pedagogy that enables people to see things, to discover things, rather than, let me tell you what all of this means. You will never understand it because I read these languages and you don't.
Right.
But and then in illustration and connection. I will also say that my methodology there is heavily rabbinic. That's the Midrash part of Womanist Midrash. I was deeply formed by rabbinical scholarship in my PhD studies. And when I left and took my first job, in addition to my ministry in the Episcopal Church, I was a member of a synagogue for 10 years. And while I was there, I studied and I taught, I preached and gave lectures. And so I have a significant Jewish formation in terms of study of scripture, in terms of classical Jewish study, Midrash, biblical interpretation. And so those things came together there. So I don't get pushback from people who are serious and engaging. There may be people say, I'm not sure that this is the root of this word. It might be this over here, but that's a different kind of argument. Now, by virtue of being on Beyonce's internet, I do get the occasional, just completely out of sorts person who makes absolutely no sense. So, there are race-based threats and death threats and you're going to hell.
That's a favorite of mine.
Right, who can't spell, can't conjugate a verb, can't write a complete sentence, telling me either I'm arrogant for saying that I have an advanced degree, or that I'm ignorant and don't know anything with my advanced degree. There's all of that sort of thing. One of the truly sad ones was actually in person. I was at a retirement home that was about equally African-American Christian retirees and white passing Jewish retirees. And someone said, oh, this is the perfect person to do Bible study with both groups. And so I came in and did my little presentation around women prophets. And this Jewish man, because it was a retirement center, there are also people there with varying types of memory care. And so I don't know where he was in his wellness, but I just put that on the table because there were lots of things going on. And he said, there's no such thing as women, knowing that for the Torah, but not necessarily in things that come after if it doesn't show up in the Haftarah, which is the second set of readings. So I said, well, let's just stay with the Torah and let's stay with the prophet Miriam, right? And he looked me in the face and said, if you have a Torah that says there is a prophet named Miriam, it's a defective Torah scroll.
Oh my God.
And I was like, okay, so we're at a place, we really can't have a conversation.
Correct.
Like, I don't know, where he is in his wellness. I don't know where he is in his religious and intellectual formation, but we're at the point where, and religiously violent, ignorant response, rather than someone saying, there aren't even arguments.
Yeah.
That,
it doesn't exist.
It's the work is largely unassailable.
I think it is. Yeah. And it's because of that rabbinic background. It really is what I come out of that sort of proxy with the rabbinic studies. So you came to sort of the rabbinic studies later in your career, correct? Like you didn't start out
in my graduate education.
Okay.
Aramaic was part of the curriculum, and you read rabbinic literature in Aramaic. So focused on the Tannaitic material, which is Mishnah and Talmud, and some early stuff. But so that was the academic piece, and then because I had an interfaith, an interreligious dialogue background going back to seminary, I rekindled that, and by the time I got to taking my first position, one of my dearest friends, who's a rabbi and father of my goddaughter, I'm from the Maryland area. He took a pulpit in DC, but he went to seminary in Philly. And so when I took the job in Philly, he recommended a synagogue. We sort of switched places in our worlds. I taught some courses for the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College, and we had a course exchange, and I had students from Recon in my classes at the seminary, and we had some an interfaith study partner group, Savruta, which is the classical pairs of scholars who study text together in Jewish tradition. We had a Savruta program. So this interreligious started in seminary. The rabbinic period, my rabbinic period, started formally in my PhD studies, and then for the full decade that I was in Philly, and now it's just part of my work.
Yeah, it's very much integrative in your work. I've seen that for sure. I kind of wanted to talk to you a little bit about interreligious, interfaith, interideological conversation too, because that's something I'm passionate about, and it's something that I'm running up into in my daily life. Because recently in my town, which is a super small town in Western New York, topping out the scales at like 13,300 people, and we are losing people every year. But with all that in mind, 95% white, 97% conservative, mostly like Catholic or evangelical Protestant town. A pastor in town who just so happened to be the middle school principal also recently felt comfortable preaching a sermon on just who is outside of the government of God. And one of the people groups that he listed was Muslims. Muslims are outside of the government of God, and they're evil. And that really, really upset me, because the more I read the Torah, the more I read, the Hebrew Bible, making the delineation there between the treatment of Christians with it versus, the Jewish treatment, and then reading the scriptures, and even a cursory look at the Quran, I see so much more evidence for interfaith and interreligious collaboration, and I'd love to hear kind of your thoughts on that, that perspective. You know, what did your studies in and your rabbinic studies, what did those yield in terms of how you feel about interreligious relationships, or really any life experiences that you have that kind of made this fabric of who Dr. Wil Gafney is?
Sure. I don't know that rabbinic scholarship itself uh, nurtures uh, interfaith, interreligious dialogues. Rather, the process of studying text and learning how do people learn text, how do people study text, how are people formed by text. Those kind of conversations are very helpful. In terms of a sort of broader religious look at how peoples with significantly different religious ideologies can function in the same world, the Hebrew scriptures have multiple threads. And one set of those threads is particular, and one set of those threads is universal. And both sets of those threads exist in the same body of literature, in the same way that rabbinic literature is often plural, two rabbis, three opinions.
Yep.
So that that aspect of rabbinic literature of people contradicting each other, multiple opinions, all of the opinions being valid, nobody splitting the synagogue. There's no great schism. Well, all of us who believe, that you have to say the Shema when you're on a trip, laying down in the road. We're going to break off and form our own committee because we are in such disagreement with those of you who say you don't, that we can't possibly worship together. And now we're just going to have, a whole new institution. Like, that doesn't happen in Judaism, no matter how serious the question is or how the rabbis fall out on it. So I appreciated the ability to hold difference in community. And so that was very formative. But looking at these differing texts and even different periods in Jesus's life, at one point he was very clear: I came for the lost sheep of the house of Israel, the rest of you on your own. He was not interested in anybody else. And then he was converted by the Syrophoenician woman, and all of a sudden he was talking about a more universal and more open gospel. So as with many things, not necessarily all things, there are multiple voices in the text. And the reader, hearer, interpreter is making decisions about what they're going to elevate. And so when someone chooses to elevate all of the exclusivistic texts, that's not necessarily God. Those texts are available for you, and you are choosing that. In the same way, even the most conservative folk who say that they are literalists now have sign language ministries, even though Jesus said that hearing impaired people have demons, right? They'll do a great contextual reading and say, well, people didn't understand how deafness worked, people didn't understand how epilepsy worked, this is the cultural language. They'll give you all this nuance, then they'll turn around right around to something else and then try to make a flat earth Iron Age reading normative. People choose when they're being contextual, and the choices interpreters make are about them and not about God. So there are texts and traditions within the biblical text that are available for talking about multicultural interaction. So there's one, I want to say it's Micah, all nations shall stream to the mount of our God. Each nation shall walk in the name of their God. We shall walk in the name of the Holy One of old. And so right there you have these processions together with people in their own religious tradition, without a call to conquer, subdue, tear down their altars, or any of that other stuff. And there's plenty of other verses to do other things, but it happens that there's also this. So there are spaces where there's plurality in the text.
I see that more and more because I came from that sort of literalist background, and it's so weird because I mean, I'm like no, I was no schlub when it came to reading the Bible. Like in my undergraduate, we had to do biblical Greek and biblical Hebrew, so there was even a basic familiarity with, with texts that were closer to the original language than an English text would be. And I had read and I had studied, and it's point off my shoulder, but I had read them, but I had never read them through that lens where that plurality was acknowledged, let alone seen as something that could be productive and valuable. And it absolutely just reinvigorated me, to come across that and to see what happens when you stop clinging to this feigned idea of literalism and you start to really experience the text, especially when you start to experience the text, looking for the voices that are either not present or that are pushed aside. I'm really excited to get my hands on a copy of the Women's Lectionary. For those of you who are watching who might not be church people, real quick, we get a really diverse audience, so I just want to explain this a little bit. So the lectionary is something that churches will use to kind of guide their sermon preparation and the life of the church, for either a 3-year or a 1-year cycle. It just depends on what kind of church you go to. So what Dr. Gafney has done has kind of taken I don't want to say the original, but like a sort of more traditional understanding of how we move through the church year. And what she's done in her work is drawn out the voices of the women and the slaves and the other in the lectionary. What do you think that, I mean, I have my opinions on what this book does, but what do you think is the value, right, of having a lectionary like the Women's Lectionary?
So one, I want to back up and say that Americans don't understand the demographics of Christianity. Mm-hmm. The majority of Christians in the world and the majority of Christians in the United States receive their scripture mediated through a lectionary, mm-hmm. and use an 80-book Bible, mm-hmm. because they are the smallest group. They have the newest Bible. The 66-book Bible in English didn't come into existence until 1782. The newest Bible, shortest Bible. So fundamental lack of understanding about how Christianity works writ large and more narrow. Scratch by a psalm or another poetic piece, mm-hmm. followed by an epistle, followed by a gospel. So you have 4 lessons for each Sunday of the year. And then those of us in the Anglo-Catholic traditions have a set of festivals that mark the year. Many people observe Christmas and Easter, but we also observe Pentecost and the Feast of the Epiphany and the Feast of the Ascension, etc. So all the 7 principal feasts. And then I threw in the Feast of the Ever-Blessed Virgin Mary, who's my favorite, and the Feast of Mary Magdalene. And we also have daily services every day of Easter week and every day of Holy Week. Mm-hmm. So that's some, 250 days of readings. Mm-hmm. And for every day, I picked a set of readings that focused on women, included women, or obscured women that could be pulled out. Mm. So the collections of readings are entirely new. No one else is reading these set units. They're thematic for the Christian year. So Advent stories, thinking of the coming of Christ. Mm-hmm. So for example, in year W, there's 4 weeks of Advent that lead into Christmas. And there's an Annunciation one, Sarah receives one, Samson's mother receives one, and Hannah receives one. So those are the 4 stories that begin Advent. That's different from everyone else's lectionary. I chose these new groups of texts together, and I translated all of them out of Hebrew and Greek myself. And I did text commentary so people would understand what the translation issues are. And then I did preaching commentary. Mm-hmm. The translation style I did is unique to this project. It's called gender expansive. So as we said earlier, if it's out as a negative term, mm-hmm. so things are gloomy or in shadow rather than equating blackness and darkness, yes. with bad or evil. Yes. In the Psalms, I intentionally use only female pronouns for God, so that people can wrestle with what it means to say that half the people, as many folk understand humanity, those numbers are must shift, but that's the way people think about this planet right now. Are made in the image of God, but we don't hear that reified in how we talk about God.
Yes.
I use a whole raft of new God language, and I offer that to the reader at the end of the book. I don't use Lord because that's hierarchical. That's also slaveholding language.
Mm-hmm.
I use Father very rarely. So it's she who is holy, the majesty of the heavens. So the language of these translations is profoundly different. And I also translate people fully from their lineages. So last week at a keynote lecture I gave uh, to my educational community, and in the sermon that's coming up uh, Sunday, I'll be talking about Jesus as the son of David and the son of Bathsheba.
Mm.
So whenever someone's lineage, they're the God of Jacob, the God of Rebecca's line. So these translations are profoundly different. The sets of reading are different. So this lectionary, this schedule of preaching, if you will, this calendar of preaching and worship resources is simply distinctive. There have been others who have done projects that gestured in this direction, but none with all of these components.
Yeah. I love that I'm still stuck that you said you set it on fire. That was fantastic. Like, because it is like, I think that sometimes I feel like really kind of cloistered in my nerdiness here. But that is a massive and comprehensive work that you have done. A debt of gratitude is like owed to you because of this work, because it is so massively different, and it is so important because language matters, because people for so long have seen themselves in the text represented a certain way because of the connection to darkness, because of the relationship of, how we speak of Hagar, because of this, that, and the other, or even just basic patriarchal language for God. There is people that have never seen themselves in the text. And I had an experience with this during one of my first semester classes, during a discussion about womanist midrash. And I said, I'm struggling to see myself in this text. And a friend of mine, who has become a friend since this comment, who is an African American female, and she said it's funny because I grew up not seeing myself in the text. And it was a fundamental and powerful moment for me as a white person to realize, like, to pull back another layer of that onion of privilege, and to realize how drastically language and visibility impact our interaction and our interface with faith. I think it's understated to say that this lectionary has the power to literally change the world. That's an understatement, in my opinion.
Well, we will see. I have been thrilled with its reception. I've been thrilled that a number of bishops in the Episcopal Church have already authorized it. My bishop bought a copy for all of the priests who are in charge of congregations. I have other bishops asking me to do trainings with them. I have bishop in Australia asking me to do work with their folk. I have pastors who have bought copies for every preacher on their staff. I preached at a good-sized church in Charlotte maybe 3 weeks ago now, and the pastor kept telling me that he and everyone he knew was switching to the women's lectionary. Our new year on the Christian calendar begins the Sunday after Thanksgiving. And as he was telling us, I finally turned to his associate and assisting ministers, and I said, does he know anybody? Because he keeps saying everybody he knows is using this project. And like, he knows a lot of people, really a lot of people that are committed to the project. So I've just been delighted by the response, by the sales, by the adoptions, by the conversations. And I'm really excited to see what people are going to do, hosting conversations about that, just in terms of a written word column. So I'll have a prompt for each week of the coming year, the year, double year of the woman, single volume, standalone volume. That one comes up within sort of so a month in advance. It will always be a month in advance, but I have that one up, and the second Sunday in Advent will come along soon. Some people have started that conversation, so I'm just really excited. Some people are using it on their own for their own devotional study, and because of the 4 reading system, I invite people to read all 4 lessons every day for a couple of days, to read each lesson once a day, and put them all together. So, in studies, you can revisit those lessons individually in combination, and then have the preaching commentary as sort of a starting place, if you'd like, for your devotional contemplation. It's absolutely useful in individual devotional use, whether the congregation is going to opt it.
Absolutely. Yeah. I as someone who always felt called to the pastor, but has not necessarily always felt the pastor and them, having a tool like this and bringing voices like yours, is just, it's inspiring to me, because I believe that, there is, to me, back to the beginning, there is something unique. Like, we have, it's not like that sexy to be a pastor, right? It's not like a professional athlete. Like, there's visceral experience, I think, in itself, and I love that you articulated that. It's just coming back. And
so I was able to do some archaeological work on my own process, and it was in, I'm going to say October, and I was trying to write a grant for a coming opportunity, and so I started this project. So I wrote the thing at my I was able to build on that and do year A. Those are the 2 years that are out. I'm finishing a second volume of Womanism International thing on women prophetic literature, and then I'll back B and C. But so I did the actual writing those 2 years, 2018 and 2020. But the project started with the idea in 2017.
That's awesome. That's what you do, and the impact you've had on my own understanding of spirituality, and I have to thank you for that. Like, I'd be remiss not to say that. So, I would love to kind of take us home with 2 questions on this whole conversation. What out of your brain would you want to put out there into the world? Of course, you put a lot of that out there with your books, but let's see.
Read it out loud. Read it 2 or 3 times. Read it in multiple translations, and then ask questions.